welcome to ETC, Education, Theology, and Culture. Last episode, Reverend Anthony Howe helped us how to study the New Testament. In this episode, we will have another special guest that will help us understand a part of Scripture. Our topic is entitled Natural Law and the Two Kingdom View. If this is your first time hearing it, then you are on the right track. Before I introduce our guest, I want to take this time personally to thank Pastor Dennis Olson of First Grace Covenant Evangelical Church for helping me making this interview possible. So let's get the ball rolling. Let me introduce to you our special guest in this episode. He is the Robert B. Strimple Professor of Systematic Theology and Christian Ethics at Westminster Seminary, California. He received an Acton Institute Novak Award last 2004, an award on outstanding young scholar who demonstrates theology's connection to human dignity, the importance of the rule or law in limited government, religious liberty, and economic freedom. He also authored a lot of books which you can check out later. Dr. VanDrunen received a Bachelor of Arts from Calvin College, a Master of Divinity from Westminster Seminary, California, a Master of Theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a Juris Doctor from Northwestern University, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Loyola University in Chicago. His current work focuses on our topic today, natural law in Reformed theology and the doctrine of the two kingdoms. So if you're not aware of this theology, in this episode, we'll explain it to you. Dr. VanDrunen right now is an ordained minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois. He is currently married to he is happily currently married to his wife Catherine, and they are blessed with one child. So, brothers and sisters, let me welcome Dr. David VanDrunen.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here.
Thanks.
It is a privilege to have you here in ETC. So, Dr. David, is this your first time here visiting Philippines?
It is my first time in the Philippines. I just arrived last night.
That is great. And I know you have a busy schedule, but I want to thank you for giving us a time to interview you in this episode.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
So let me get straight to the topic. What made you pursue this topic, natural law and the two kingdom view?
Well, my interest in the topic really goes back a long ways.
Mm-hmm.
I was, even when I was pretty young as a teenager, I had interest in law and politics, but I was also a serious Christian, and I wanted to think about how some of those things related to each other. Now, when I first began my theological studies, when I was doing my Master of Divinity degree, I really didn't hear anything about these ideas of natural law, the two kingdoms.
Okay.
But I was thinking about issues related to them, thinking about Christianity and culture issues, thinking about issues of theology and law, and I wasn't entirely satisfied with some of the things I was hearing about those topics from my teachers or from other people in Reformed churches, and I'm a Reformed theologian, and so I was very curious about these, and I went and I studied law after my first theological degree, and that really stimulated my thoughts more, because now all of a sudden I was at a secular law school, and I was thinking about how do I talk with other people, how do I talk with non-Christians about the law, how am I as a Christian to think about the law. So I kept thinking, and I was trying to work through these issues in a theologically sound way. And at this time, even though I was studying law, I was also reading a lot of theology. I was still reading theology. I didn't stop reading theology, and I was reading some older Reformed theologians. I mean, John Calvin, for example. And I noticed that Calvin and other theologians were talking about natural law, and they were talking about the two kingdoms. And I thought that was curious, because when I was trained in Reformed theology, I really hadn't heard about these things. And when a lot of even Reformed people talk about these subjects, they talk about natural law as if it's just a Catholic idea, or the two kingdoms as if it's a Lutheran idea. So I decided I wanted to explore these topics some more, because they sounded like they might be promising and they might be helpful. So I continued to to think about these issues, and then so began to explore natural law and explore the two kingdoms. And I kept doing that when I went to my I did my PhD degree in theological ethics. And it turned into a much larger project that I've now been working on for, well, in some form or another 15 or 20 years.
So before you publish your your books regarding this topic, before it was that the idea is there, but it's kind of scattered, and what you did was form this into a more organized teachings.
I think you could put it that way. Yes, my first big book on the subject was a historical study, trying to explore what older theologians had said on these subjects, and then try to understand how Christian thinking had developed on these topics. And then some later things I've written have tried to explore the topics on a more biblical theological basis, and to try to develop how we ought to think about these subjects, and not just what older theologians have said.
Nice. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolute, how would you rate this topic, natural law and the two kingdoms?
It's really hard to answer that, because there are a number of different ideas caught up in these two topics, and so, I mean, these are two distinct ideas, natural law and the two kingdoms, and I think they're related, but there are some people who like one of the ideas but don't necessarily like the other, so it's hard to answer. I would say that there are some aspects of this topic that are pretty close to a 10. So for example, in Romans 1, Paul says that all people know God, right? Even if from the created order, right? And that because they all know some basic things about God and some basic things He requires from human beings, that all people are accountable to Him. And so that means that on the final day, on the day of judgment, everyone is going to have to answer to God. Everyone's accountable to God. Now, I would say that's a pretty fundamental Christian belief.
That's true.
And that's very much related to the idea of natural law. So I would say natural law in some form is getting pretty close to a 10. However, there have been a lot of different ways that Christians through history have understood natural law as they tried to work out the details. And so I would say that there are different ways that there are different ways a person could describe natural law or understand it and still be a good, solid Christian. I would say with the two kingdoms idea, it does seem to me very important in that what you think about some broader ideas of Christianity and culture are going to influence the way you live in this world. It's going to influence the way you interact with unbelievers. It's going to interact the way you think about your work, about the books you read, about the movies you watch or don't watch, or the way you vote. So I would say that the issues are important, but I think it is important to recognize that there have been a lot of different views of Christianity and culture through the history of Christianity. And I don't think any one particular view can say this is the only Christian view. Now, I've tried to explain what I think is the most biblically faithful version, but I don't think it's not a test of Christian orthodoxy the way one's belief in the Trinity is Christian orthodoxy.
For example, we have a theology of Calvinism. They have what we call an alternative view of Calvinism, which is called Arminianism, which is the total opposite of its teaching. In this natural law and the two kingdoms, is there an alternate view or another view that people believe in?
Yeah, I think again that's complicated. There's not just one alternative. I mean, I would say that most Christians through history have believed in either explicitly in natural law or something similar. So most Christians have believed that there is some kind of natural revelation, some revelation in creation. And so just to put that in a way that those who haven't studied theology can understand, this idea is really, it's rooted in a number of biblical texts. But the idea is that just by being a human being, just by living in this beautiful, glorious world that God has created, that all people know something about God and know something about what He requires of us. They know the basics of morality. They know that they shouldn't kill. They know that they shouldn't steal. They know that they shouldn't lie.
It's like a what we call a default setup, something like that.
Well, it is something like that. Now, that doesn't mean people can't deny those things, because a lot of people do. Romans 1 says all people know these things, but it also says that people suppress this knowledge. Right? They want to deny that these things are true. So I would say that most Christians through history believe in something like that, but a lot of people don't. There have been many who don't like the terminology of natural law for some reason or another. And really the point of controversy, I would say, is not over whether there is some natural law, but what role it plays. How much do we think unbelievers really can know? And what importance does that have, say, for example, if we're active in politics? That could make a difference, right? I mean, if you think that unbelievers really know certain things, that may affect the way that you conduct yourself politically. Now, I would say, in terms of the two kingdoms, that gets at broader views of how do Christians relate to the broader culture. What is of course, all Christians, or at least almost all Christians, would say Jesus has established His church, and we're all obligated to be members of the church and worshiping participants in the life of the church. But we also recognize that there's a bigger world out there, and that some way or another we have to relate to this broader world. So the question in these questions that we sometimes refer to as Christianity and culture, we're really exploring that question. Now, I would say that there are a range of views, and let me put it this way: there have been some Christians through history, and still today, that we might say are very triumphalistic. And by that I mean they believe that it's Christians' responsibility to try to take over all parts of the world for Christ, right? And that we want a Christian government. We want all our schools to be Christian, or all our businesses to be Christian. We want a Christian culture. We want our nation to confess Christianity, and have a strong belief that here in this world we're going to establish the kingdom of Christ in the whole broader world. All right, so I would say you have some Christians that are on that side, or maybe lean towards that kind of a view. Of course, there are different ways to explain that. Now, on the other side, there have been a lot of Christians through history that have thought, well, we as Christians, we really need to get away from the broader world. The world is evil. We don't want to be contaminated by the world. So maybe we need to go off and just live by ourselves. We're only going to read we'll read the Bible and Christian books. Maybe we'll set up our own Christian businesses and only do business with each other. Now, there are some very extreme views on that, but there are also some others who are not quite that extreme, but lean in that direction and tend to be very. They don't trust the world. And maybe they interact with the world. Maybe they get a job, but it's only because they have to in order to feed their family. So I would say you have those two kind of views that are on the extremes. Now, I would say that the two kingdoms idea is an idea that tries to get a better balance, that recognizes, on the one hand, that Christians have responsibilities in this world. It's good for Christians to be involved in business, to be involved in government, to be involved in the arts, to be involved in science. But on the other hand, to recognize that this is a sinful world, and it's always going to be a sinful world, and that until Christ comes again, we're never going to be able to create some kind of paradise on earth. And we have to remember that we're always going to have to interact with unbelievers. And so I think the two kingdoms idea tries to take both of those things seriously. And so I hope that helps to get to the
That's
questions.
very helpful. So more or less, these what we call natural law and two kingdoms aims to strike the balance between the two.
I think so.
So Dr. VanDrunen, what does natural law mean here in this context of our topic?
Sure. Well, one thing it doesn't mean the laws of physics.
Okay.
All right. Now, you could use the term, you could talk about laws of physics as natural laws, and some people do. There you're talking about the regular course of nature. What do things do, right? When we're talking about natural law here, we're talking about law in moral terms. And so when we talk about the law of a society, or we talk about the law of Moses, then we're not talking about scientific things. We're talking about moral things.
Right and wrong things.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. And so the natural law is, first of all, a kind of a law. What is a law? Well, a law is something that instructs us how to live, how to conduct ourselves. Right. So natural law is a law that's unwritten. It's not a law that any human governor or legislator has decreed. It is, I would say, first, it's the law of God. It's God's law. But it's a law that God reveals to us in creation itself, in nature.
Maybe some people call it conscience.
Well, okay, that's a good question, right. What I would say is, natural law is not the same as conscience, because conscience is something that each of us has. Each of us has a heart, right? Each of us has a mind. And as part of being human beings that have a heart and mind, we have a conscience that makes judgments about right and wrong. So what I would say is that it is through our consciences that we know the natural law. The natural law comes from God. The natural law comes from God through His creation, through the way He's made the world. And then it's through the gifts that He's given to us, like our minds, our hearts, through the conscience, that we come to recognize that right and wrong. And so what we could say is, you might ask, well, in what way is don't steal? In what way is that natural? Well, I would say, this is not I'm sure there are other things you could say, but just part of the answer I would say is, well, let's think about how this world works. Imagine a society in which there were no rules about stealing. Imagine if everyone just took whatever they wanted from whoever they had it. Now, what would that society look like? It would be chaotic. There would be no productive economic activity because you couldn't, no one would plant a field because someone would just go and steal it. You wouldn't start a business because someone would just steal what you had, right? And so you can say, look, given the way this world is, given the way we are as human beings, we have to have some conception of property and we have to have some kind of respect for each other's property. So you see, the idea of stealing being wrong is not some arbitrary rule. It fits the order of the world that God has made. And I think we could talk about that in terms of sex, in terms of the command, do not commit adultery. That's not an arbitrary rule. That actually, that orders our lives in ways that fit who we are and what's good for us and the way we need to live if we're going to have productive, orderly, fruitful lives. And so it is, I would say, remember, it's God's law, because God's the one who made this world. God made nature the way He did. He made us the way He did. All right, but we know these things through an understanding of the creation order. Even people who have never read the Bible, right? At least deep down, they know these things.
Just as what you said earlier, maybe some people suppress this truth and deny. That's why they don't believe in God. They think these things are randomly acts or just something that opinion of other people.
Well, that's right. That's right. Yeah, there are a lot of people who will not acknowledge that there is this objective morality, that there's a true morality. Now they will say, well, you know, we may have to have certain kind of rules just in order to, you know, figure out ways to get along. But that's ultimately just our opinion, or it's just what we find convenient or find useful. And so, yeah, what Scripture says about this in Romans 1 and 2 especially. But I would say Romans 1 and 2 is not the only place that you find this in Scripture, although it is quite clear there. But what you find Scripture saying is really so true. People know these things, but they suppress these things. And of course, then in Romans 2, Paul talks about the conscience and people's consciences making judgments, and people's consciences judging themselves when they fail to obey these things. And we often see this in unbelievers, don't we? That people have a sense of guilt for things, and they don't like that guilt. They wish they didn't have it. But often we see the work of conscience even in people who don't want to acknowledge the existence of God.
How about the two kingdoms? What does these two kingdoms represent?
Sure. Yeah. The two kingdoms gets at the idea, first of all, that God rules all things. God is the supreme king of all the world. He created the world. He sustains the world. Everything is ultimately accountable to God. Right? The two kingdoms gets at the idea that God has a twofold rule of this world. That though He rules all things, He doesn't rule everything in the same way. So the first thing I would say then is the two kingdoms are God's two kingdoms. It's not as if one kingdom belongs to God and the other kingdom belongs to Satan or to you.
Because I think some of the teachings in the Bible tells us that there's actually two kingdoms, God's kingdom and the devil's, what do you call it?
Well, that's true.
Earthly kingdom.
Now, I mean, we could potentially talk about three kingdoms. I mean, we could talk about the kingdom that Satan tries to establish, by which he fights against him. But when we talk about the two kingdoms doctrine, we're not talking about Satan's kingdom, right? We're talking about two kingdoms of God. So on the one hand, you have this rule of God that I like to call the common kingdom. It is a rule of God that is that's rooted in His creating and sustaining this world. Right? So God rules the whole world in general. He upholds the order of nature. He upholds human societies, right? All over the world, right? There are human societies, and we find in them that people are doing business, that there are laws, there are governments, there are schools, people are doing art and science. And I mean, in many of those societies, there are few, if any, Christians, and yet we find God sustaining these societies. And God there are good purposes for those societies. There are actually good things that happen in those societies. I mean, they're not good in that they merit any salvation for God, but there are still, we still see some elements of truth and some elements of beauty in those things. And so what I say is that through God's work of creation, His work of providence, we find these societies all over the world. We find families, and we find economic life, and law, and government. Now, on the other hand, God also has a kingdom which I like to call the redemptive kingdom. So God is not just sustaining all the world and preserving a certain goodness in the world, but He's also redeeming a people for Himself. He's gathering the church to Himself, calling people out of darkness into His light. And I think we see through the church, through the ministry of the gospel, we see that God is establishing a different kingdom. And ultimately, I would say this redemptive kingdom, it's ultimately the new creation. That's what it is, right? It's heaven. It's this new creation that's coming. That's the kingdom that's going to endure forever and ever. As Hebrews 12 says, it's a kingdom that cannot be shaken, right? That's this kingdom we're talking about. And this kingdom, even now, is being, already you can see it in the church, right? In the ministry of the church, in the life of the church, you see the power of that kingdom. It's interesting that in the very first time that the New Testament refers to the church, it's in Matthew 16. Jesus says, I will build my church. It's quite a well-known text. You remember what he says right after that? He says, and I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Right? So he's giving his kingdom, that new creation, the kingdom of heaven. Right? The church has the power of that kingdom. So that's a basic explanation of the two kingdoms. Right? And so I, as a Christian, I belong to both kingdoms in some way. Like when I say I'm a citizen of both kingdoms. All right. I mean, I have obligations in ordinary life, in common life. Right. Christians get jobs. They open businesses. They work with all sorts of people. Right. They don't just do business with the Christians. They can do business with other Christians. They can participate in law and government and all these things. So we as Christians have obligations in that common rule of God, but we also have obligations, and our highest obligations is to that other kingdom, to that redemptive kingdom that God is establishing. So that's a basic summary of what the two kingdoms is about.
So maybe it's like similar to what we call God's general revelation and God's special or particular revelation in the Bible.
I think I think it has a lot of similarities.
That's good. What is its connection to the two kingdoms view? This natural law.
Yeah, I would say here, and I think this gets back to your comment about natural revelation and special revelation. If we're going to understand our life in the common kingdom, right, and I think we have to recognize that the only way that the common kingdom and the life of the common kingdom is possible is because of the natural law. I mean, we have to admit that most people in our human societies, they don't know the scriptures.
That's true.
There are many societies in the world where there aren't Christians at all. They don't know the Bible. And yet, how is it that these societies obviously aren't perfect by any means, but how is it that they still have laws against killing and stealing? They still have some measure of peace. They still, you still see good things happening in these societies. There's still some measure of order, some measure of justice in them. We really can't explain that other than that there is that natural law that even though many people wouldn't want to acknowledge that it exists, they still can't help but live by it in certain ways. And so I think for that we as Christians, as we think about our life in this world, obviously when we think about the common kingdom, when we think about our life in the broader world, of course we want to think about how Scripture helps us to understand that life. And Scripture does tell us a lot of very important things about how we are to live with our various responsibilities. But we also recognize that Scripture doesn't tell us everything. I mean, a long way from telling us everything. So we still need to be students of the world, right? We still need to study the world around us. We still need to figure out how to live within it, even beyond what Scripture tells us. And I think there we're talking about natural law. We're talking about observing the world, trying to figure out how the world works. And so I think that to have a strong view of natural law helps to explain how it is that the two kingdoms how the two kingdoms continues to exist. Or what I should say is how the common kingdom continues to exist, even though so many people don't acknowledge God or don't know the Scriptures.
So I think we can see that in what we call, for example, here in the Philippines, we can see that the government officials, some of them are not Christians, but they still uphold the law, which is consistent with what the Bible is teaching.
Right. And so you as a Christian, as a Filipino Christian, can say, well, that's good. I mean, we wish that those non-Christian government officials were Christians, right? We'd be happy to have opportunity to explain the gospel to them, but we're still thankful to God when our government officials do things that are just. We know that they often do things that are unjust, but we're grateful when they do things that are just. And we can acknowledge that it's because of his common rule of this world, his providence restrains evil, and it's in part through his natural law that he does restrain that evil.
And I think another follow-up question is, how does this understanding of the natural law and two kingdoms help me in my daily Christian life?
Yeah. Well, here's one thing that I would say. I think there are a number of different things that are that could be important, but here's one. I would say the doctrine of the two kingdoms helps ordinary Christians to have a proper view of their ordinary vocations, of their ordinary occupations, right? I'm a full-time minister and professor of theology, so I don't have a regular, you might call it a secular job or a common occupation. But the vast majority of Christians have some sort of ordinary work, right? I mean, they're farmers, or they're doctors, or they're bakers, or they're moms and dads, right? They have some sort of ordinary occupation. And sometimes it really bothers Christians when they say, well, how am I to live in this? I have this job, I'm a farmer, but there are a lot of non-Christians who are farmers too. I mean, so how am I to look at my job? I would say that the idea of the two kingdoms can be really helpful for Christians here, because it helps them to understand, number one, that when they undertake these ordinary jobs, that is good, that's honorable, that God has established the common kingdom, that they can serve God in being a farmer, in being a doctor, in baking bread, in cleaning streets, whatever they do, they're able to give honor to him because he has made this world, he sustains that world, and they can also serve their neighbors too. The person who's a farmer, what a great service that is, growing food for his neighbor. The one who's a doctor, what a great service to be able to bring healing to those who are sick. The one who bakes bread. I mean, so you can. I think we can understand that there's a real dignity, there's a real honor in doing good work and doing hard work, even if it's, you might say, it's common, it's ordinary, it's mundane. No, it can still be God glorifying. On the other hand, we also can recognize that these common jobs, common occupations that we have, there's something different about those jobs than the preaching of the gospel. Right? We're not saving anybody by being a farmer. We're not saving anyone by being a doctor. Right? Now, that doesn't mean it's not important. It's honorable to God. But we also recognize that we also need the church, and we also need preachers. The church needs to do its ministry. And so I think the two kingdoms helps ordinary Christians to have a high view of their ordinary work, but also to remember that this is not all that there is. There are other things that are crucially important for advancing God's work in this world.
Because in the past, I heard that as a Christian, our only focus is, the weight of our maybe responsibility or ministry is only to share the gospel.
Yeah.
But maybe when you're working, for example, for a baker, a farmer, maybe that's more of a secondary. This view sees the importance of both and doesn't neglect any of those.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think if you hold a good two kingdoms view, you'll do exactly what you're saying. Right? Is that you will not. You would never say to the farmer, well, being a farmer is not important, but unless maybe you have opportunities to witness to people, through your work of farming. Well, no. Your work as farming is very noble. It's very dignified, and God is pleased when you do it well. So it's a way, I think, to give some some encouragement to ordinary Christians that they can do common work, and they can work alongside unbelievers in doing this work, and that can still honor God. Now, they have to remember that the work of the church is absolutely essential for advancing the gospel. So we don't want that being a farmer or being a doctor or being a baker to become everything for them. You want to keep it in perspective. But I hope the Two Kingdoms idea helps maintain a proper balance of those things.
So these people who are working what we call common jobs will not be discouraged. That they might think that what they're doing, planting fruits, is as a very inferior or something that we do
Right.
like that.
That's right.
And that will help them and give them encouragement.
I hope so.
Thank you, Dr. David, for explaining these things. These things are really helpful for those Christians who haven't heard of this theology. Aside from reading regarding this topic, how can we, as Christians, improve or develop our understanding of this natural law and two kingdom view?
Sure. Well, in terms of the Two Kingdoms, perhaps it might be helpful for all your listeners to really give some thought as to how they look at their jobs, their ordinary, and that could be, maybe their, when I say job, I mean the place where they go to make a living, but it could be the way they look at being a mother and a father, or other sorts of activities in the world. Why are they doing them? When you go to work in the morning, are you going just to make money, just to get a paycheck so that you can have the things that you want in life?
Different perception of
Or are you going to serve God? And are you going to serve your neighbor? Now, of course, we want to, we all need to make a living. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think when we think about the Two Kingdoms, it reminds us that God has established these various areas of life. He preserves our society, and we ought to be serving Him and serving our neighbor in them. So I think people could think about that. But I think they could also have some reflection about the importance of the church to them. Because I think a lot of Christians can become so busy with everything. I know that's true in the United States, and it's probably true here in the Philippines too. You get very busy. And sometimes you forget about how important the church is. In fact, you forget that the church actually should be at the center of your life. Because it's in the church that Christ is saving a people for Himself. It's in the church that you have the power of that kingdom that cannot be shaken. And so I hope that if your listeners want to try to think about how to put these things into practice, they might think about both their ordinary work and the church, and maybe they need to adjust their attitude and adjust the way that they prioritize their time. With respect to natural law, here's one idea. Your readers might study the book of Proverbs, and to think about the way the book of Proverbs works. It's not the entirety of the book, but a lot of the book is about observing the world around, seeing how things work. Getting a sense of, if I do something to you, what are you likely to do in back? If I'm here and I speak nasty words to you, or I hit you, how are you going to respond back to me? Or on the other hand, if I speak a peaceful word to you, maybe you insult me. Instead of insulting you back, I give you a kind word. So those are just some examples. But if you look at Proverbs, it really encourages us to be thoughtful about the world around us, to think about things. And that's actually a way of studying the natural law, because it's really trying to understand the world around. It's not just about memorizing the Ten Commandments. I mean, that's great. If you don't know the Ten Commandments, memorize the Ten Commandments. It's great. All right, but just because you know the Ten Commandments doesn't mean you really know how to live a good, productive life in the world. I would recommend giving attention to the idea of wisdom, because I think a big part of wisdom is understanding the natural law, understanding how this world works, and how we can really how we can be productive and fruitful as we live in this world.
And I think I can insert a passage from James that if we lack wisdom, we could ask God to give us this wisdom, and God will give us generously this wisdom.
Yep, that's absolutely right. We don't gain wisdom just by our own effort, but I think we need to read these texts together. Proverbs encourages us to do some hard work, to observe the world, to be thoughtful about the way we live. But James reminds us that it's ultimately only if God blesses us are we going to be wise people.
You mentioned earlier, and I think maybe this will be the last question. You mentioned earlier that Christians who have a balanced sense of natural law and two kingdoms, you would also focus or would not neglect their common jobs. But I don't know if this topic is related with this, or maybe it's another whole topic entirely. But when, for example, I am a farmer and I do plant fruits, can I call it ministry? Or ministry is subject to church focus only, or preaching of the word, sharing the gospel?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it, of course, depends on how you define things like ministry. I personally, I would prefer reserving the term ministry for the church, because I think when people, I think when we use the term ministry, we're trying to express something about advancing the gospel, advancing the kingdom of Christ. Now, the term ministry, in a way, just means service. So, when someone is a farmer and does that work, well, is he offering a service to other people? Yes, he is. But I would say we want to make sure we don't think that that's the same thing as the service of the church, of the ministry of the church, because as I was talking about Matthew 16 earlier, what is the ministry? Well, the ministry of the church is the keys of the kingdom of heaven. That's the farmer, when he's planting his fruit, he's not exercising the keys of the kingdom of heaven. He is doing a good work for this world, right? But it's only when we are ministering with the authority of Christ in his church that we can say that we are actually opening up the gates of the kingdom of heaven.
So is it safe to say that a Christian who is doing good in their common job, but not having a part of what we call preaching the gospel or sharing the gospel, what he's doing is not enough? Can we say that?
Well, I would say that yes, in a way. Now, I would not every Christian is called to be a preacher of the gospel, right? So I would say that every Christian is obligated to support the work of the church, to be a faithful member of the church, to worship at the church, and as the New Testament says, that we all need to be ready to give an answer to the one who asked for the hope, the reason of the hope that's within us. And so I think that does go beyond than just our ordinary occupation of being a farmer or a doctor.
Sir, Dr. VanDrunen, anything you want to share to our audience about this topic?
Yeah, well, I would encourage all your listeners to be thinking about these topics, because they probably are thinking about them indirectly.
Sure.
And so I would encourage them to be thinking a little more theologically about them, and I would encourage them to be going to work each day, or to be doing their jobs in the home every day with an attitude of service to God and neighbor. But I really encourage them all to be making the church and their commitment to the church and the worship in the church to make that first and not just an afterthought.
Thank you, David, Dr. David VanDrunen.
My pleasure.
If you want to know more about Dr. David VanDrunen's work, you can check it out in the books in Amazon. I will put the link here in the video. Actually, right now, I'm not sure if I'm updated or not, but currently, I'm not sure if these books are being sold here in the Philippines. But if his books is already being sold in the Philippines, I will let you know. I will give you an update. Okay, once again, we want to thank Dr. VanDrunen for his time. And I also want to thank you guys for listening, and I hope you learned a lot from these episodes. If you have questions or if you want a topic that you are not familiar or you don't know and you want ETC to discuss it, feel free and don't hesitate to comment below. Once again, I'm Wayne, your host, and reminding you to subscribe, share, and see you soon. Shalom!